Welcome to Dunamis, where people of faith meet the social and spiritual challenges of the day. In this episode, we will take a look at faith and psychology, and our focus is on the philosophy of Dr. Jordan Peterson. Dr. Peterson is a professor at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist and the author of the million-plus selling 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos, which has been a #1 bestseller in the US, Canada, and the UK, and has earned him critical acclaim, as well as a burgeoning fan base. Dr. Peterson's YouTube channel features his university and public lectures and responses to the polarizing political crises of today. His original self-analysis program, the Self-Authoring Suite, has helped over 200,000 people resolve the problems of their past, rectify their personality faults and enhance their virtues, and radically improve their future. He has a wildly popular Patreon page and offers a monthly Q&A as an additional effort to bring accredited online humanities education to as many people as possible around the world. In this episode of Dunamis, we will look at excerpts from his interviews and lectures, all which address the Judeo-Christian perspective, which regularly appear in his narrative. Here is a sample of Dr. Jordan Peterson and his views on faith and psychology.
People often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense. And the reason that it's an attempt to box me in is because the question is asked so that I can be firmly placed on one side of a binary argument. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And they think they know. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero. So it's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis. But strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Now you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. So that's a good enough answer for that. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions. Now, I believe that for all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes, it's divine. It's associated with death and rebirth, clearly, because the Logos dismantles you and rebuilds you. So that's what happens when you make an error. When you make an error, some part of you has to go. That's a sacrifice. You have to let it go. Sometimes it's a big part of you. Sometimes it can be such a big part of you that you actually die, right, instead of dying and being reborn. Is there something more than merely metaphorical about the idea of dying and being reborn? Yes, there is, because those are associated with physiological transformations. What's the ultimate extent of that? That's a good question. You know, the question is, what happens to the world around you as you increasingly embody the Logos? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what the ultimate level of this. Now, the hypothesis is, and it's a hypothesis that extends to some degree to Buddha as well, the hypothesis is that there has been one or two individuals who managed that, and that in their management of that, they transcended death itself. Well, then you might ask yourself, well, what do you mean by transcended death? Well, in the case of Christ, let's assume he was a historical figure for the time being, which I think is the simplest thing to assume. I think there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. You could conclude otherwise, but personally, I feel that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. Is his resurrection real? Well, his spirit lives on. That's certainly the case.
In what sense do you mean spirit, just to qualify that?
Well, let's imagine that a spirit is a pattern of being. And we know that patterns can exist, patterns can be transmitted across multiple substrates, right? Vinyl, electronic impulses, air, vibrations in your ear, neurological patterns, dance. It's all the translation of what you might describe as a spirit, right? It's that pattern. It's independent of its material substrate. Well, Christ's spirit lives on. It's had a massive effect across time. Well, is that an answer to the question? Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know. The accounts aren't clear, for one thing. What the accounts mean isn't clear. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well.
Do you just tend to describe yourself as a religious man at all?
I would definitely describe myself as a religious man, yeah. I think that's fundamentally true. The devil's in the details. So what does that mean exactly?
I've seen you being asked the question, do you believe in God? And that's not a question you necessarily find it terribly easy to answer.
Well, I don't know what people mean when they say believe. Like it's as if that question explains itself when it's asked. It's like it doesn't. What do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by God? And what makes you think that the question that I'm answering is the same one that you're asking? This is not something that you can say yes or no to in any straightforward manner. So I find it an off-putting question. And I don't think it's because I'm avoiding the issue. I think that to answer it properly requires books and lectures. So,
do you see yourself at least in the Christian tradition as far as your, I suppose, worldview?
There's no doubt about that because I'm a Westerner. There's no escape from that.
Yeah.
I'm conditioned in every cell as a consequence of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so I've read a fair bit in other religious traditions and have a reasonable grasp on some of them, I would say, not trying to overestimate my knowledge, but we're saturated in Judeo-Christian ethics, and so...
I've seen you say that you certainly live your life as though God exists.
Yes, I would say, well, to the best of my ability, right, yeah. And I think that that's the fundamental hallmark of belief, is it's how you act, not what you say about what you think you think.
Sure.
What do you know about what you think? Seriously, I mean, we wouldn't need a psychology, an anthropology, a sociology, any of the humanities if our thoughts were transparent to ourselves. They're not in the least. There are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also possessed, fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. And there's a satanic arrogance about that. In fact, that is the archetypal arrogance that's portrayed in the mythological character of Satan, because Satan is precisely the archetype of the element of the mind that believes that it can twist and bend the structure of reality without paying the price for that. And you can't imagine anything that's more arrogant than that, because really, do you really think that you can twist the structure of a reality and that that's going to work out for you without it snapping back? It's so obvious that that can't work, that everyone knows it. But anyways, back to the initial point, is that you know by the rules of the game that you yourself are playing, that some of the times you're violating the rules of the game that you're playing. And the first issue with regards to, say, stating the truth or behaving in a responsible manner would be merely stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. It'll start to straighten out your life. And so, well, the flood, how does the flood tie into this? Well, you know, we live in a corrupt structure. We're corrupt as individuals. We live in a corrupt structure, and part of that corruption is just happenstance. It's the way things fall apart. But the other part of it is that not only are we not aiming up, we're actually aiming down. And the flood story is a warning, and it's a very clear warning. And the warning is, if you aim down enough, and then if enough of you aim down at the same time, everything will degenerate into something that's indistinguishable from the chaos from which things emerged at the beginning of time. It's something like that, because the cosmos that's presented in mythological representations is chaos versus order, right? The order is on top, you might say, and the chaos is always underneath. And the chaos can break through, or the order can crumble, and you can fall into the chaos, and that chaos is intermingled potential. And the way that you destroy the order and let the chaos rise back up, which is exactly how it's portrayed in the flood story, is by inhabiting the corpse of your father. That's one mythological motif. And feeding on the remains, and with no gratitude and no attempt to replenish what it is that you're taking from. And the warning in the flood story is, don't do that for very long, because things will happen that are so awful you cannot possibly imagine it. And that'll happen to you personally, and it'll happen to your family, and it'll happen to your community, and it's happened to people over and over throughout history. And it's quite interesting, you know, it's very soon after the story of Cain and Abel when you see evil enter the world in the story of Adam and Eve, along with self-consciousness. And evil there is the ability, that's the knowledge of good and evil, that's the ability to hurt other people self-consciously, to know what you're doing. And then, of course, instantly, Cain takes that to the absolute extreme, and he uses that capacity to destroy really what he loves best. He gets as close as a human being can to destroying the divine ideal, because, of course, his brother is Abel, and Abel is favored by God, and Cain destroys him, which Cain tells God at the end of that episode that his punishment is more than he can bear. And I think the reason for that is, where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you? There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down. And, you know, there's an idea that was put forth very nicely in Milton's Paradise Lost, when he was describing, from a psychological perspective, essentially what hell is. And hell is, you're in hell to the degree that you're distant from the good. That might be a good way of thinking about it. And if you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell. And the way the story, the biblical story, unfolds is, well, it's Cain, and then it's the flood. And so Cain adopts this mode of being that's antithetical to being itself, at least to positive being itself. He does it voluntarily. He does it knowing full well what he's doing. And the net consequence of this, that as it ripples through the entire social structure, is that God stands back and says, this whole thing has got so bad, the only thing we can do is wipe it to the ground. And that is no joke. That's exactly how things work. And one of the things that's extraordinarily terrifying about that sequence of stories, and I believe this to be true, I think I realized this independently of any of the analysis that I was doing of mythological stories, because I looked at what happened in places like the Soviet Union and Maoist China and in Nazi Germany, and the most penetrating observers of those societies, the people who were most interested in how it was that those absolute catastrophes came about, all said the same thing. It was rooted in the degeneration of the individuals who made up the society. You know, you hear, well, people were following orders. It's like, no, that explanation doesn't hold water. Or that you'd be punished if you resisted. Well, there was some truth in that, but nowhere near as much as people might think, especially at the beginnings of the process. More it was that people decided, each and every one of them, to turn a blind eye to the catastrophes and to participate in the lies. And that warped the entire societies, and they went as, you know, they veered their way downward to something as closely approximating hell as you could hope to manage, especially in places like Nazi Germany and, well, in all three of those places, in Maoist China and in the Soviet Union. And so the thing that's so frightening about, one of the things that's so frightening about the stories in Genesis is they say something very clear, which is that your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos. And you say, well, I would like my life to be meaningful. People say that. Really, would you? Really? You really would like your life to be meaningful? You think maybe people would trade a little nihilism to not have to face that particular realization, and I think people do that all the time. It's a terrible weight to realize, but we are networked together. That's the price of, or let's say, that's the vulnerability that's associated with our intense capacity to communicate. And it is certainly possible that the ripples of our individual actions have consequences that are far beyond the limits of our immediate consciousness. And I also think people know that too. They know that in the way that people know things when they don't want to know them, which means they know them embodied. They can feel them, they can sense them, they have an emotional response to them, but there's no damn way they're going to let them become articulate because they don't want to know. And when you're feeling guilty and ashamed about the things you've done or not done, and I know that can get out of hand as well, it's often because there is a crooked little part of you that's aiming at the worst possible outcome. It's really fun to look at these old pictures once you kind of know what they mean. You know, at least that's what I've discovered, is that once I kind of understand the underlying rationale for, I mean, someone worked hard on that. That's an engraving, right? They took a long time making that picture. They're serious about it. And when you understand what it means, you know, all those people, they're prostrate at the revelation of the law. It's like, well, no wonder. It's like, break the law and see what happens. Break the universal moral law, man, and see what happens. You know, I see people in that situation, well, as you all do all the time, perhaps me more than you because I'm a clinical psychologist, you know, and if the people I'm seeing haven't broken the universal law, then you can bloody well be sure that people around them have. It's no joke. Like, you make a mistake and things will go seriously wrong for you. And so it's no wonder that you'd be terrified at the revelation of the structure that governs our being. One of the things that's so remarkable about the Old Testament, this is another thing Nietzsche commented on. He was a real admirer of the Old Testament, not so much of the New Testament. He thought it was a sin for Europe to have glued the New Testament onto the Old Testament, because he thought the Old Testament was a really accurate representation of the phenomenology of being. It's like, stay awake, speak properly, be honest, or watch the hell out, because things will come your way that you just do not want to see at all. And it might not just be you, it might be everyone you know and everything about your culture that is demolished for generation after generation. It's like, stay awake and be careful. And I think that people only don't believe that when they're being hubristic. And I think that most people know that deep in their hearts. You know, when you get high on your horse, that happens fairly often. If you have any sense, you think, geez, I better be careful and tap myself down a fair bit, because if I get too puffed up, man, something's going to come along and take me out at the knees. And everyone knows that. Pride comes before a fall. It's like, if you have any, that's why it says in the Old Testament that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It's like, I have never, in all my years as a clinical psychologist, and this is something that really does terrify me, I have never seen anyone ever get away with anything at all, even once. You know, there's that old idea that God has a book, you know, and keeps track of everything in heaven. It's like, okay, you know, maybe it's not a book. Fine. But that is a really useful thing to think about, because, well, maybe you disagree. Maybe you think people get away with things all the time. I tell you, I've never seen it. What I see instead is that thing happens, right? Someone twists the fabric of reality. And they do it successfully because it doesn't snap back at them that moment. And then like 2 years later, something unravels. And they get walloped and they think, oh my God, that's so unfair. And then we track it. It's like, well, what happened before that? This. Well, and then what? This. And then what? This. And then what? Oh, this. Oh, that's where it went wrong. It's, yeah, because you can't twist the fabric of reality without having it snap back. It doesn't work that way, and why would it? Because what are you going to do? Twist the fabric of reality? I don't think so. I think it's bigger than you. You know, and I think that one of the things that really tempts people is the idea that, well, I can get away with it. It's like, yeah, you try. You see how well that works. It's like you get away with nothing. And that is the beginning of wisdom. And it's something that deeply terrifies me. And, you know, ever since last September, when I came to more like broader public attention, one of the things, I've been terrified of making a mistake, because I certainly know I'm more than capable of making a mistake. And thank God so far, either I haven't made one or no one's found out about it. So, but it's like, you know, we walk on a very thin and narrow edge. And we're very lucky when things aren't degenerating into chaos around us or rapidly moving to far too much order. And it's not an easy thing to stay on that line. And you can tell when you're on that line, because things are deeply meaningful and engaging when you're on that line. But if you're not existentially terrified about the consequences of wavering off that, then you are truly not awake. So, and that's what I see in this picture. You know, it's like, look out, man, because there are rules. And if you break them, God help you. Christianity makes the assumption that the Word of God that pulls order out of chaos at the beginning of time, it's a logos, is the thing that's Christ, you know, so many eons later. They're the same thing. It's like, well, what the hell does that mean? Well, it's like, if you embody the immortal soul properly, you're the thing that generates order from chaos. Or sometimes the reverse. You make, you know, you're the transforming agent that sits at the middle of order and chaos. Okay, so that's the same thing that was there in the beginning. Well, that's the beginning of being, not the beginning of the universe. It's the beginning of being. Those aren't the same thing. So, and the Christians figure out that this logos thing is very much associated with articulated truth. Articulated truth. And so the Christian idea, in part, is, and this is where Nietzsche had it wrong, I think, because he was too cynical about Osiris. He was too cynical about Christianity. He thought all it was rotten infrastructure. You know, so he saw how it had become dogmatized and corrupted across time, but he didn't see what was in the center of it. And, you know, his Superman was sort of a substitute for that. But he never fleshed that out well. But Jung started to play with the Superman idea and with the idea of the Philosopher's Stone, and he was studying Christianity, and at one point he saw, uh-oh, those are the same thing. They're all the same thing. It's complicated, but one of the things that Jung recognized was that the core doctrine of Christianity, in some sense, is the truth buttresses you most thoroughly against the vicissitudes of being. That's your salvation, the truth, the spoken truth. It's not, so you might say, well, people say, Christians say, well, if you believe in Christ, you're saved. Well, what do you mean by believe? Exactly. You say Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and you say, I believe that. Just because you say that doesn't mean you believe it at all. It has almost no bearing on what you believe. The question is, how do you act? And the fundamental question that's under all that is your speech true? Now, then you might ask, well, what does true mean? Well, and the answer to that would be, it's twofold. What are you trying to do with your speech? There's two things you can do with it. One is, you can manipulate reality so that it does what you want it to do. So, and that's the sort of speech that people use when they're trying to get what they want. The problem with that is that there's no way that they can't actually know what they want. They just hypothesize what it is that they want based on some theory, and then they try to manipulate the world so that they get that. But it's an unsatisfying venture, and often when they do get it, it's not good anyways. So, and it involves a kind of falsity of speech. The other way is to try to say what you mean and think and perceive as clearly as you possibly can, always, and see what happens. Now, the story that underlies Christianity, and it's not only Christianity, but it's Christianity that I'm most familiar with, is that the rule is live in accordance with the truth and see what happens. So in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Christ basically says, set your sights on allegiance to God. It's like whatever the highest value is, we'll say. And act in a manner that's concordant with that. So that's your goal. Then pay attention to the here and now. Your best strategy for the future. Well, you know, then you might say, well, prove that. It's like, well, that's when the question starts to become existential. It's like, well, you can't prove it. You have to try it. That's like Kierkegaard's leap of faith. You cannot tell if this works unless you do it. And that's a commitment. It's like, because those two ways of being, like the manipulative way of being, that's an adversarial way of being archetypally. It's manipulative. It's got the lie at its core. That's completely different than this path. So it's a hypothesis. Well, it's a hypothesis that Jung did a good job of elaborating. Although, you know, even with Jung, It's not fully articulated. He's still saturated in image to a large degree, but no wonder. It's very complicated to make this sort of thing fully articulated. You read Solzhenitsyn, you think, okay, why did the Soviet Union become the absolute hellhole that it was? Solzhenitsyn says, because everyone lied. It's like, oh, isn't that interesting? Well, that isn't a hypothesis that you hear every day. So then you think about Freud and you think, well, what's the major cause of mental illness? Repression. Well, that's a lie, fundamentally. I mean, Freud's played around with it to some degree, so it's sort of like, it's more like lying by omission, actually, than lying by commission. But it doesn't matter, it's still lying. Jung says the same thing. It's like, oh, well, wouldn't it be interesting if the fundamental root of psychopathology was the lie? The fundamental root of political psychopathology is the lie. It's like, well, what if that's what's demolishing your life? You know, people say, well, people think, especially when they're nihilistic and they become destructive, that the universe is sort of, it's an unfair and arbitrary place, and it's basically bent on their random destruction while they suffer. It's something like that. Yeah, right. Okay, what do you do under those circumstances? That's the question. Well, one potential answer is twist the thing so that you can maybe get what you hypothetically want out of it. The other is rely on your perceptions and your capacity for accurate representation, communicate that, and take your chances. It's like, who's right? Well, that's the battle between good and evil. Who's right? It's a continual battle.